Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, Ukrainian historian and scholar, philosopher as well. And I want to welcome you to another edition of Eye on Ukraine, number 13. And I want to talk about the history of Russia and Ukraine insofar as that history has a bearing on the tension between Ukraine and Russia and the war that's been going on for 3 years now. Now, I've mentioned before in some other videos that US President Trump wants a hair-footed ceasefire and end to the war. He said he could do that one day when prior to being elected as president, certainly didn't do that. And this is a very dangerous maneuver as far as I'm concerned. It's dangerous because without knowing the history of these two countries, of these two nations, these two peoples, there's literally no chance, and I emphasize a just peace. For peace to be lasting, it must be just. All right. And so to do that, we need to go at least back to the 17th century, the mid-17th century, to understand some of the tensions that arose at the time between Russia and the Ukraine. Now, a story I'm about to give you is from my book, Putin's Obsession with Ukraine, that I just finished today. At least I finished the draft, and I'll be submitting it for publication soon. I'm excited about it. I think it's a pretty good book. Now, Ukraine came into its own in 1648 with the successes of the Cossack-led Jackeries. Jackeries are peasant uprisings, but they were led by the Cossacks, and they were aided by an alliance, surprisingly, with the Tatars against Poland, Lithuania. There were key victories in the battles of Zavtivody and Korsun, both in 1648, with overwhelming support of the Ukrainian peasants, much abused by Poland and Lithuania, who sided with Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Warsaw itself was vulnerable had the Ukrainian hetman wished to march into it. He did not. Polish fragility led to the Treaty of Zborov, 1649, which granted formal recognition to the provinces of Kiev, Chernihiv, and Bratslav as Ukraine, so-called at the time. It also granted surcease for the knots of hostilities between the Zaporozhian Cossacks and Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. All right, let's go to screen share for a little bit here to see the geography, what's going on at the time. And I'll put this on. So here we have, let me make this a little bit larger if I can. Not that large. Here we have Ukraine with, at the top, we have Chernihiv. Then we have Kiev. And then we have Bratslav. These three people made up the Ukraine at the time in 1649, according to the treaties. Now, as we see to the left, west, we have the Lithuania here and Poland below it, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They were in fact one nation. And then to the north and to the east, we have Russia. The Great Russian Bear, and then to the south, we have the Ottoman Empire, the Crimean Khanate, the Tatars, right around Crimea and the Syria below. So Ukraine is encircled, as it were, by potential enemies. When the Cossacks first came to be, they gathered around the Dnipro, beneath the rapids. That's what Zaporozhian Cossacks is named after. Zaporozhia just means beneath the rapids, so they went beneath the rapids and formed the Zaporozhian Siege, where they gathered in. Everybody was welcome to be a Cossack, but these were mainly disfranchised Polish nobility or Ukrainian nobility in Poland at the time. Couldn't make a go of it. unhappy serfs, defrocked ministers of the clergy, Tatars, other people from other tribes. All people, in some sense, were welcome to become a Cossack, in a sense. So the early Cossacks, we consider their Ukrainian roots in the Cossacks, with the Cossacks, but the Cossacks were not really an ethnicity per se. They were defined functionally by what the Cossacks did. Pretty much anybody was welcome within certain limits. You had to prove yourself a good fighter and so forth. So the Cossacks formed. Let me close this off for a while. And what we had is the Ukraine itself, for the first time, being recognized formally by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1649 as itself as a viable political entity. Now, the Cossacks were not really, in any respects, suited to be a political entity because the Cossacks at least preached early on radical egalitarianism. Cossacks were equals in some sense. They had a hetman, of course, but the hetman was literally the leader in battle, and his voice was not necessarily any stronger than any other voice when he was in the siege, when they were not at battle. Ukraine has some sort of formal recognition as a polity, as a political entity of some sort, 1649, by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, as I said, Khmelnytsky could have marched on into Poland, into Warsaw. So great were his victories, and so unexpected it was in a weakened state. He chose not to move on towards Warsaw. His goal was not to destroy the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but he considered Ukraine, as it were, as a vassal state of the Commonwealth, but he wanted to be treated respectfully. He did not want the Polish army to come in and attack them every so often and disobey all the treaties. So after the 1649 Treaty of Zborov, there were further hostilities between the Commonwealth and the Ukraine. There was the Battle of Brest-Litovsk in 1651 and Zvanets in 1653, where the Cossacks fought against the Commonwealth once again. Problem with these battles was their Tatar allies turned against the Cossacks in both cases. There were 3 instances where the Tatars turned against the Cossacks, and this proved costly. As I mentioned before, the Tatars generally provided the cavalry for these assaults, and the Cossacks mainly fought on foot. They were foot soldiers. So why did the Tatars turn on the Cossacks? Principally because they, in some sense, worried about the Cossacks getting too strong. As we've seen from the other picture before, Ukraine was sort of in the middle with the Crimean Tatars beneath them, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to one side, the Russians to the north and to the east on the other side. So it was a very tenuous situation for the Cossacks, who were not used to the sort of stratified living that you got in Poland, Lithuania, or even in Moscow, where the Tsar was the godlike figure. So there was, with continued tension in the battles of Brest-Litovsk and Zvanets, 1651, 1653, the Ukrainians, Khmelnytsky needed a reason that he needed to turn elsewhere for an ally. Couldn't trust Poland, Lithuania, couldn't trust the Tatars because they turned on him thrice. He turned to Moscow. At least they had religion in common, Orthodox Christianity. So there, and this is one of the great treaties in the history of the relations between Ukraine and Russia, Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654. This was a pledge, in some sense, where the Ukraine, what would be called the hetmanate, the Cossacks in the 3 principalities, right, that were called the Ukraine, were reduced in some sense to vassalage to Russia. And that was okay for the hetmanate, for the Cossacks. for Khmelnytsky so long as Russia would protect the Ukrainians. So again, like we were circled by three dominant powers at the time. Now, as it turned out, Russia did not honor the treaty. And when Ukraine needed their succor in assistance against Poland, Lithuania, or against the Tatars, Russia was not there providing full assistance. The state of vassalage meant, in some sense, that you would recognize the Tsar as sovereign and supreme, but the Tsar had, in Ukraine's state of vassalage, the Tsar had duties to help the vassal state, namely the hetmanate. All right, so there we have another extraordinary treaty in 1658, the Treaty of Hadiach. Now, this promised, it's a very singular treaty, and I shall bring up another picture here. This promised to make a commonwealth of, bring this up, of Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, the three principalities that were recognized to be Ukraine. And if we look at this picture here, we see on top, right here, we see Poland, right, already in some sort of confederation between the two for many decades. And then we see the state of Ukraine to the south and to the east. And Ukraine always had this problem of being sandwiched between all these powers. So one way of solving the problem of how they could subsist being sandwiched by all these powers is to have a lasting treaty of some sort with some power. But Vladislav didn't work. Russia proved it couldn't be trusted. And Poland, why would Ukraine even trust Poland at this time with all the failed treaties? Because they had a long-lasting, a decades-long treaty with Lithuania that seemed to work. So maybe Ukraine could trust. If this was a treaty that granted Ukraine an equal status to Lithuania, to Poland, except that the Polish king, in terms of foreign affairs, would ultimately adjudicate, even though Poland, Lithuania was a polity that really was ruled by the aristocracies more than the king. But still, the king would have adjudicating powers when it came to foreign affairs. So this promised to be a very intriguing partnership. And it was not seriously pursued or entertained for an abundance of reasons, but a few important reasons, one of which was Polish people always looked down on Ukrainians. They considered them to be Bulgarians. And they weren't also the Polish people, Polish nobility especially, was not all that interested in assimilating Ukrainians. But then again, they did that with Lithuanians, who were at the time not Catholics, as were the Poles. So the Confederation was supposed to be called the Grand Duchy of Rus. It never came into effect for some of the reasons that I spoke of. And result of the treaty, Moscow obviously was angered, and they sent an army of some 150,000 men into Ukraine. Ukraine countered with an army of Cossacks under the lead of new hetman Ivan Vyhovsky, who was Khmelnytsky's successor after his son was hetman for a short period of time and not very successfully. Now, Vyhovsky gathered together his Cossacks and they routed the Muscovites in 16 at the famous Battle of Konotop, which was 100 miles northeast of Kiev. Now, Alexei, the Tsar at the time, panicked and they fortified Moscow for fear that Vyhovsky would travel northern in a northern direction to Moscow and overtake Moscow. This was the nadir, as it were, of early Russia. Russia, just like Poland when Khmelnytsky in 1648 came in, was very vulnerable. And if Vyhovsky would have pushed on, he might have taken Moscow. And who knows what history would have been like after that. One of the reasons why he didn't push on is because of divisiveness within the Cossack community. The Cossacks were always divided after Khmelnytsky. They were divided between those who favored relationships with Poland and those who favored relationships with Russia. The Tatars were not really much of a consideration due to the fact they weren't Christians. They were considered to be more barbaric. So we had, the Treaty of Hadiach was ratified, but it never went into effect. So Vyhovsky was dissuaded from going into Moscow, and Tsar Alexei was saved in some sense. Now, I want to just say there are a few other things before I close here, other important events. So these are some of the most important events. Pereyaslav in 1654 was the signal event. Many Russian scholars point to that, and Putin himself points to that as one of the key events, of showing the unity, the oneness of Ukrainian and Russian people. One of the reasons why the Ukrainians, in one of the proof of their unity, coming up, Jeff. Proof of their unity was the fact that Russia could give, Nikita Khrushchev could give Crimea in 1954, 300-year anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav, to Ukraine, the Ukrainian SSR. And that's another story for another time. There's a lot to say about why he gave that to Ukraine at the time, and Putin wasn't too happy about that. But we had many events after that. So we have the beginning of tensions with the Treaty of Pereyaslav, the presumed oneness of the Ukrainians, which the Russian scholars always say proves the oneness of Ukrainians and Russian people. Ukrainians willfully submitting themselves to the authority of Tsar Alexei. We had the treaties of Andrusovo in 1667 and the Eternal Peace in 1686, where Russia and Poland, Lithuania tried to solve the Ukrainian problem by warring against Ukraine, the Cossacks, and carving up the hetmanate, carving up Ukrainian territories, the three principalities among themselves. And so there were great hostilities there. There was the Great Northern War between the Swedish king, the young Swedish king, Charles XII, and Peter the Great between 1700 and 1721, right? And where Peter the Great proved himself superior, at least of having a superior strategy to Charles XII, and where Sweden was reduced to the status of a third grade or second grade military power thereafter, instead of a global power. There were the Haidamach Jackeries, peasant uprisings in 1734, 1750, 1768, where a group of sort of like Robin Hood-like men gathered together, and they caused all sorts of problems for Ukrainian oppressors, Polish especially. And Taras Shevchenko has one of his poems where he talks about, I think his grandfather was one of the revolutionaries of the Haidamach movement. There was the end of the hetmanate under Catherine, the great Catherine II in 1764, where Catherine just disposes of the problem by raising the hetmanate, raising the Zaporozhian siege in 1764. There were attempts for Ukrainians to develop an identity based on the peasantry that surrounded them. As I said, the Cossacks themselves were sort of heterogeneous mix of all sorts of ethnicities, and their unity came in their functionality, came in how they behaved, what they did for a living, as it were. But in response to these efforts to establish a Ukrainian ethnicity or nationality, there was Russian hostility and Russian oppression or yoke. There's the Valuev Circular in 1863 and the Ems Decree in 1786, which imposed severe restrictions on the publication of Ukrainian literature. And in effect, it was trying to bar the use of the Ukrainian language, which was established. And they were trying to quash Ukrainian identity, ethnicity. Then we have in the 20th century, early on, the establishment of a Ukrainian state in 1918, which is formally recognized, right? This early state was quashed by Bolsheviks rather quickly. And so that really came to nothing. There was the famine, the Great Famine, Holodomor, it's called, in 1932 and 1933, in which as many as 4 billion Ukrainians were starved to death by Joseph Stalin for refusing to collectivize their farms and not obeying the dictates of Stalin's stormtroopers, as it were. His red brooms come in and dictate to the peasants how they had to run their farms, that there needed to be state-run farms. All the farms, small farms, needed to gather together and make a large farm in the manner of a factory. 4 million Ukrainians were starved to death, many other people as well. There was, things were going somewhat swimmingly in the USSR till Chernobyl in 1986. Ukrainians were greatly dissatisfied with the very, very tardigrade, the very slow Russian response to the nuclear disaster, the greatest nuclear disaster, and this did much to turn Ukrainians against Russians, Ukrainians who were in some sense close to, you might say, close to being Russified, to turn them against Russians and so forth. All right, there was the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, after Ukraine declares its independence, like other nations as well, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Ukraine declares independence December 1991. Formally, they become free. And there is, in response to that, the Budapest Memorandum by George Bush Sr., who is really averse to Ukraine having nuclear weapons, understandably so. I think his argument was something like, if Russia and Ukraine have nuclear weapons, it's really hard for the United States to control both. It'd be a lot easier if one or the other had all the nuclear weapons. And since Russia at the time was showing signs of, with Gorbachev, running the USSR, Russia was showing signs of democratizing, right? And so what we have here is that 1994, Ukraine agrees to give all of its nuclear weapons, and they had, I think, the third or fourth largest array of nuclear weapons by any nation. They agreed to give them all to Russia on the condition, according to the Budapest Memorandum, 1994, that Ukraine be protected in the case of any sort of attack on its sovereignty, threat to its sovereignty. It be protected by Russia, Britain, and the United States. Of course, what happened? Russia is attacked, right, in 2014. Ukraine is attacked in 2014 by Russia. Crimea is taken. Putin enters the Donbass. In 2024, there's continuancy, an attempt by Putin to take all of Ukraine in the war that's still ongoing. No help from the United States, no help from Russia. This is part of why it's so important for Zelensky to have security guarantees. You promised us once, right? If we gave over our nuclear weaponry, we gave over much to our nuclear weapons, which could have protected us. And you promised us, and you didn't, right, back up your promise. So here, as we can see, there's a lot going on. There has been a lot going on between Russia and Ukraine from the mid 17th century to the present day. Treaties made and broken. I didn't even mention the two Minsk agreements in 2014, 2015, which were made and signed by Russia and Ukraine and violated immediately by Russia. Putin had no intention of abiding by those agreements, right? He mentioned that on February 28 in the Oval Office to Trump, and Trump didn't listen. And he and Vance just unloaded on Zelensky when Zelensky was trying to explain we made treaties with Putin before he didn't abide by them. Of course, that's not interesting that Trump keeps saying, well, you need to give Putin a break. After all, he's a child abductor, a murderer. He bombs hospitals. He bombs cities while Ukraine is trying to bomb oil refineries and things like that. The fact that our president today, this moron, this orange face plutocrat, this orange face autocrat thinks we need to cut Putin a break. Someone who is a convicted war criminal needs the full effect of his deeds. My opinion, this punk should suffer a slow and agonizing death before he passes, right? So that he can presumably reflect on all the shit he's done to all other people, even his own people who are wallowing in massive poverty while the great Russian war machine advances on. 40% of all of their business, of all of their economic ventures are put into the war effort. Very little is done to help the average Russian person make ends meet. And increasingly, very few Russians accept the wealthy, and there are very few wealthy except those who work in the interest of the state and very dear to Putin can make ends meet. Anyways, I hope you like this. What I tried to show here is that you can't just have a quick without some recognition of the history of these two peoples, without some recognition that there were treaties made before and violated on the Russian side. Some treaties were violated early on between Ukraine and Poland, Lithuania. Not to say Ukraine early on in its history was completely innocent in terms of contraventions of treaties. There's no reason to think that was the case either. But at least when we certainly get to Putin's reign, we get to the Budapest Memorandum 1994, Ukraine was entirely abandoned. The Minsk agreements, Putin did not agree to them. And they're a sore spot with Zelensky and Ukrainians. And the fact that the United States and England did not come to the defense of Ukraine as it promised to do, right, with the Budapest Memorandum is a big sore spot. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll do more. And I'll talk in an upcoming episode about, I'll do a sort of psychoanalytic profile of Vladimir Putin. Maybe I'll do one on Donald Trump as well. He's a major player here. Hope you enjoyed it. And TTFN, we'll do this again. Thank you. And share and like.